Good morning. My name is Cindy Bertram, and I'm providing tech support to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy for the Protocol 28 webinar today. Before the webinar begins, I would like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. We have close to 150 people that have registered for the presentation this morning. And because of this, we will be muting all attendee computers to avoid any background noise and interference. The presentation will be by a PowerPoint presentation. It will take approximately 30 minutes. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. During the presentation, as questions arrive or you wish clarification about anything, we would encourage you to use the question box on the right-hand side of your screen in the panel. Following the presentation, and when we get into the question period, we will be dealing with the questions that are recorded there, and they will be answered in the order in which they have been received. So without any further ado, I would like to turn the presentation over to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today. The Land Remediation section of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy recently introduced and implemented Stage 13 amendments to the CSR, the Contaminated Sites Regulation. These came into force February 1st, 2021. The scope included significant changes and updates to a series of protocols. Today's webinar will focus on Protocol 28, which is called 2016 Standards Derivation Methods. This protocol describes how the ministry derives numerical standards that are prescribed in the CSR. To start, my name is Heather Ostachoff, and I'm the manager sponsor of Protocol 28. I'm a manager of risk assessment and remediation in the land remediation section of the ministry. I'm speaking to you today from Chilliwack, and I'd like to acknowledge with respect that I live and raise my family as a grateful visitor to the lands of the Scoquel Nation, Xiactl Nation, and additional Stolo peoples, whose relationship with the land continues today. I'm joined today by two speakers who are co-leads on this protocol, Sydney Love and George Sheffer. Sydney, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Heather, and good morning, everyone. My name is Sydney Love, and I am a Senior Risk Assessment Officer with the Land Remediation Section. I would like to acknowledge with respect that the work I do for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy is from the Surrey office, which is located in Coast Salish territories, with the closest nations being the Coquitlam, Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo peoples. I am a grateful visitor to the land and strive to be mindful of the connection it holds to the Indigenous peoples and the goal to protect human health and the environment for everyone and everything, including plants and animals. And George?
Thanks, Sydney, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for participating in this webinar today. My name is George Sheffer, and I work as a Senior Contaminated Sites Officer and Hydrogeologist in the Land Remediation Section of the Ministry of Environment. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, which lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Kikite, and Squamish First Nations. I thank these nations for having cared for this land for the benefit of all. And back to you, Heather.
Thank you, George. Next slide, please, Cindy. This webinar today on Protocol 28 will be showing how numerical standards are calculated by walking through the contents of the protocol. Authorities to establish this protocol come from the Environmental Management Act, or EMA, under Section 64, and the Contaminated Sites Regulation, or CSR, under Section 67. This protocol describes how soil, sediment, vapor, and water standards are developed or derived by the ministry. Numerical standards are key to the delivery of contaminated sites remediation under EMA and the CSR, as they are used to define a contaminated site, to support the application of land, water, vapor, and sediment uses, and to define when remediation to numerical standards has been completed. Protocol 28 provides the rules, calculations, and toxicological equations, assumptions, and parameters used to set the CSR numerical standards, which are essentially substance concentrations. Next slide, please. Numerical standards are prescribed in the CSR Schedules 3.1 to 3.4. Numerical standards can be generic numerical standards, or they can be the more complex matrix standards. For example, Schedule 3.1, which describes soil standards, Part 1 contains matrix standards with 9 factors and 8 land uses, which inform the derivation of the substance concentrations contained in the CSR. Schedule 3.1 Part 2 is different from the complex matrix standards in Part 1, as it contains generic numerical standards that describe 1 factor to protect human health and substance concentrations for 8 land uses. Note some standards are mandatory to be applied to all contaminated sites, while other standards are only applicable when relevant to the contaminated site. This is set out by EMMA, the CSR, and protocols. One explicit area is CSR Section 12, subsection 8. Each schedule in the CSR is relevant to one environmental medium. Schedule 3.1 contains soil standards. 3.2 contains water standards. 3.3 contains vapor standards, and Schedule 3.4 contains sediment standards. These are the environmental media regulated at contaminated sites, and note that water standards apply to both surface water and groundwater, as described in the Water Schedule 3.2. In addition, George will be speaking later regarding the soil standards that are protective of the water pathways. These are concentrations of substances in soil that protect water. Sydney and George will take over from here, please. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks, Heather. So Protocol 28 is arranged into 10 chapters, which are mostly broken down by the environmental media and their related uses. The introductory chapter, Chapter 1, contains an extensive acronym list due to the number of technical terms used throughout the protocol. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 correspond to soil land use standards, and they are divided into specific endpoints or pathways, which are human health, ecological health, and soil to groundwater protection. The next 3 chapters correspond to the remaining media, so that's water, vapor, and sediment uses. Chapter 8 contains information on the toxicity reference values used for calculating standards. Chapter 9 explains the adjustment of soil standards to account for background. And Chapter 10 contains some final pieces of information. There are also extensive appendices and tables in this protocol, especially in Chapters 4 and 8, which help to account for why it's so long at over 180 pages. Next slide, please. We will now go through a high-level description of each chapter, starting with Chapter 2. This chapter details the derivation of human health soil standards, which can be found in CSR Schedule 3.1 Part 1, the matrix soil standards, or 3.1 Part 2, the generic soil standards. There are 8 land uses, and they are listed on the slide. This chapter contains definitions and lists the assumptions relating to who the critical receptors are, land uses, and descriptions of their land use scenarios, the assumptions for critical receptors, for example, body weight, lifespan, and soil ingestion rates, and the duration of time receptors are exposed based on a given land use. It presents 2 methods of standards derivation. Method 1 shows the equations for calculating carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic standards when there is sufficient toxicological information available. It also includes the rules around selecting between those 2 types of standards if both have been calculated. If there isn't enough information to use method 1, there is an alternative, which is method 2, where standards are adopted with modification from the United States Environmental Protection Agency's regional screening levels. Next slide, please. Chapter 3 explains the derivation of environmental or ecological health soil standards, which can be found in CSR Schedule 3.1 Part 1, the matrix soil standards, or 3.1 Part 3, the generic soil standards. The same 8 land uses from the previous slide are relevant to these standards as well. The chapter contains definitions and assumptions for relevant receptors, direct and indirect exposure pathways, and levels of environmental protection. It has the details for 3 distinct environmental protection site-specific factors. First, toxicity to soil invertebrates and plants, for which there are 2 derivation methods. Standards are preferentially calculated using a regression method, where the data is grouped or binned into categories, and a regression line is then calculated. If that is unsuccessful, then a geometric mean method is used. The second site-specific factor is for livestock ingesting soil and fodder, and the necessary derivation equations are included in this chapter. The third factor is major microbial functional impairment, and the adoption information for these is included. Next slide, please, and over to you, George.
Thanks, Sydney. In the preceding two chapters, Sydney outlined the derivation of the Human Health and Environmental Protection Matrix numerical soil standards. This chapter, Chapter 4, outlines the derivation of the remaining matrix numerical soil standards provided in CSR Schedule 3.1. These are the soil standards for the protection of groundwater or a specific water use. We'll look at these specific soil standards in a subsequent slide. So the matrix soil standards are calculated for prescribed soil to water pathways or site-specific factors. These are based on the water uses that apply at a site and include the following: groundwater used for drinking water, groundwater flow to surface water used by aquatic life, groundwater used for livestock watering, and groundwater used for irrigation. Which water use applies at a site is determined using Protocol 21, Water Use Determination. The soil standards are calculated using the Ministry's Groundwater Protection Model, provided in Technical Guidance 13, titled Groundwater Protection Model. The model consists of 4 components or modules: leaching of substances from a source material, transport of the substance through the unsaturated or vadose zone, mixing of the substance with groundwater, and lastly, transport of the substance to a receptor. I'll outline the calculation process, but there's a lot more detail that can be provided here. Users should consult the chapter for more specific details on the model framework, substance selection, substance properties, default site conditions, weight and transport equations, assumptions, calculation procedures, and other details. So calculation is a 4-step process and operates in a backwards mode. In other words, from receptor to source. It works this way in 4 steps. So step 1, to start, the applicable water use standard, drawn from the generic numerical water use standards in Schedule 3.2, is assigned as a receptor concentration. The saturated zone concentration below the source is then calculated using a 10-meter transport distance from the receptor. And step 2, the saturated zone concentration is then mixed in groundwater to produce a concentration above the water table. Step 3, the water table concentration is then transported through the unsaturated zone to produce a leachate concentration in the source area. And the final step 4, the final step is to partition the leachate concentration to the source material as a soil concentration. The soil concentration is then rounded and or adjusted for background to produce a soil standard. This is the soil standard provided in CSR Schedule 3.1. Let's look at the specific groundwater protective soil standards on the next slide. Next slide, Cindy. So this slide shows an example matrix from CSR Schedule 3.1 for the substance molybdenum. The 4 blue arrows highlight the matrix numerical soil standards calculated using the Ministry's Groundwater Protection Model. These are the derived soil standards for the protection of groundwater for the 4 water uses or site-specific factors. The other human health and environmental protection matrix numerical soil standards, as derived in chapters 2 and 3 that Sydney spoke about earlier, are also shown on this slide. For human health, these are the intake of contaminated soil standards. For environmental protection, these are the toxicity to soil invertebrates and plants, livestock ingesting soil and fodder, and major microbial functional impairment standards. Next slide, Cindy. To close out this chapter, this slide provides a screenshot of the Ministry's Groundwater Protection Model. In the upper left corner of the screenshot, we can see the substance selected, in this case, molybdenum. We can also see substance properties and site-specific factors that apply at the site in question. In the lower left, the default and site-specific factors are shown. The conceptual site model is shown in the upper right, and the arrows show the direction of calculation, that being receptor to source. Lastly, in the box in the lower right of the slide, the calculations are shown for each step or module, including the final calculated soil standard. Next slide, Cindy. So let's move on to chapter 5. Chapter 5 provides the derivation of the generic water use standards provided in CSR Schedule 3.2. Water standards are provided for 4 water uses. These water uses include aquatic life, irrigation watering, livestock watering, and drinking water. To tie this slide back to Chapter 4, these 4 water use standards are used as the receptor concentrations in the derivation of the groundwater protective soil standards in CSR Schedule 3.2. The aquatic life water standards are based primarily on the Ministry's approved and working water quality guidelines, but also on the CCME and Canadian Environmental Quality Guidelines and the Canadian Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Federal Environmental Quality Guidelines. The aquatic life water standards use a 10 times multiplier of the guideline values on the assumption that there is greater than 10 times dilution of groundwater available before discharge to a receiving environment. Some aquatic life water standards are derived by the ministry. These include the petroleum hydrocarbons, EPHW, LEFW, and EPHW. It also includes non-chlorinated phenols, cadmium, the chlorophenol standards provided in Technical Guidance 9, titled Chlorophenol Aquatic Life Quality Standards, and the standards for zinc as provided in Protocol 10, hardness-dependent site-specific freshwater standard for zinc. Aquatic life standards are not rounded. I'll have more information on the rounding method when I speak later in this presentation on Chapter 10. The next is drinking water use. Drinking water standards are set by either adoption of a drinking water guideline from another jurisdiction or de novo derivation by the ministry. Adoption is from one of the following sources: the Health Canada Guidelines for Canadian Drinking Water Quality, the ministry's approved water quality guidelines, drinking water sources, US EPA regional screening levels, the Ministry of Health drinking water guidelines, US EPA national primary and drinking water regulations, or the World Health Organization guidelines for drinking water quality. De novo derivation is outlined in the chapter for both carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic substances. Drinking water standards are not rounded. The final water uses include irrigation and livestock. The irrigation and livestock water use standards are set by adoption of a water quality guideline from one of the following sources: the ministry's approved and working water quality guidelines and the CCME Canadian Environmental Quality Guidelines. Similar to the drinking water use standards, irrigation and livestock water use standards are not rounded. But overall, the water use standards are largely toxicologically based, although a few aesthetic standards remain in the schedule, for example, for chloride, sulfate, and sulfide. Next slide, Cindy. So now let's look at a portion of the actual CSR Schedule 3.2. This schedule shows the generic water use standards for the 4 water uses. As mentioned on the previous slide, the water uses are aquatic life, irrigation water, livestock watering, and drinking water for the protection of human health. Let's talk about some other highlights in this schedule that also apply to many other schedules in the CSR. A schedule lists substances in alphabetical order, whereas in previous CSR versions, substances were provided by chemical classes. The schedule also includes chemical abstract service numbers, or CAS numbers, for each substance. These are used as specific identifiers for substances to facilitate listing and identification, and to avoid the confusion with the many synonym chemical names for some substances. Lastly, note that schedules in the CSR, like Schedule 3.2, contain many footnotes that describe additional information about the standards in the schedule. For example, in Schedule 3.2, some water use standards are only applied to a site if certain limited Schedule 2 activities were conducted at the site. Such a qualification is called differential application, and it's identified by footnotes at the end of the schedule. Accordingly, when reviewing the standards in the schedules, users should consult the footnotes for other factors or more information specific to the respective standard. So this completes my talk on Chapter 5. Next slide, please, and over to you, Sydney.
Thanks, George. Chapter 6 provides the derivation for the generic vapor standards, which are found in Schedule 3.3 of the CSR. There are 6 vapor uses: agricultural, urban park, residential, commercial, industrial, and parkade use. Unlike the soil standards, residential vapor use is not divided into low or high density, and parkades is a use that is unique to the vapors. This chapter contains assumptions for receptor characteristics, exposure durations, and the equations for deriving carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic standards. Next slide, please. The generic sediment standards are found in CSR Schedule 3.4 and are explained in Chapter 7. There are 2 different sediment uses, sensitive and typical, and 2 water salinities, freshwater and marine and/or estuarine. This means that for each substance, there are 4 standards. The information relating to the sediment standards derivation is included in the chapter. Next slide, please. Chapter 8 discusses the Toxicity Reference Value Database. Toxicity reference values, or TRVs, are the maximum exposure to a substance that doesn't cause an unacceptable adverse effect. This is a critical component of numerical standards calculations to ensure that the standards are protective of human health and ecological receptors. This chapter lists the hierarchy of sources used for selecting TRVs that are then used to derive standards. The ministry does reserve the right to select TRVs outside of the hierarchy if something is considered more appropriate, as supported by scientific rationale. The crystallization date of November 30th, 2015 is included in this chapter, which was the cutoff date for adopting values. This applies to TRVs and guidelines, but also more broadly to default parameters in the equations and the groundwater protection model. This means that if a value changed after November 30th, 2015, it would not be reflected in the numerical standards. This is to account for the lengthy process of regulatory change, because the standards, and therefore TRVs and guidelines, need to be finalized well in advance in order to prepare the regulatory package for review. There are 4 appendices of tables which contain the TRVs themselves. 8A for human health soil TRVs, 8B has ecological health soil TRVs, 8C the human health drinking water TRVs, and 8D the human health vapor TRVs. Next slide, please. Chapter 9 is on background adjusting soil standards. The ministry has a database of soil samples, formerly in Technical Guidance 17, but now found on a new webpage called Background Concentration Databases. This data is used to calculate the regional background values found in Table 1 of Protocol 4, and are also used to calculate a provincial background estimate. The numerical standards in CSR Schedules 3.1 Parts 1, 2, and 3 can be background adjusted to reflect natural background conditions. This is done when the calculated standards, as explained in Chapters 2, 3, and 4, are lower than the provincial background estimate. Next slide, please, and back to you, George.
Thanks again, Sydney. Chapter 10 contains additional information that is applicable to more than one chapter or the entire protocol. It provides information on qualitative standards and the rounding rule used for rounding of the calculated standards. The first section of the chapter is qualitative standards. These include non-aqueous phase liquids not present and odorous substances not present. These qualitative standards are found in various schedules in the CSR. As noted earlier in this presentation, qualifying information on the qualitative standards is provided in the schedule notes or footnotes at the end of the schedule. For non-aqueous phase liquids not present, the note indicates soil must be remediated so that non-aqueous phase liquids are not present in quantities in excess of that acceptable to a director. For odorous substances not present, the note is similar and indicates soil must be remediated so that odorous substances are not present in quantities in excess of that acceptable to a director. For both qualitative standards, what constitutes acceptable to a director is provided in Protocol 16, titled Determining the Presence and Mobility of Non-Aqueous Phase Liquids and odorous substances. The second chapter, or the second section of the chapter, provides the rounding rule for calculated standards. Using the rounding rule, the calculated standards are rounded to generate the final standard. The rounding rule is essentially one significant digit followed by a second digit of either 0 or 5, whichever is closer. The easiest way to conceptualize the rounding rule is to put the calculated standard into scientific notation and then adjust the second digit to either a 0 or 5, whichever is closer. There are some exceptions to the rule noted in various chapters in the protocol. For example, as indicated in Chapter 5, the drinking water, irrigation, and livestock water use standards are not rounded. So this completes our talk on the various chapters in the protocol. We'll move on next to highlight some of the recent changes to the protocol. Next slide, Cindy. So in this slide, I'll talk about the recent changes to the protocol from the earlier version. The previous version of Protocol 28, approved November 2017, included only Chapter 4. As noted earlier in this presentation, Chapter 4 provides the formulation of the Ministry's groundwater protection model, and, using the model, derivation of the matrix numerical soil standards for the protection of groundwater. The Ministry's groundwater protection model is provided in Technical Guidance 13, titled Groundwater Protection Model. Chapter 4 was developed in 2017 to support other protocols that were revised at the time, including Protocol 2, titled Site-Specific Numerical Soil Standards, and Protocol 13, titled Screening Level Risk Assessment. This was done as both Protocols 2 and 13 are also based on the Ministry's groundwater protection model. The current version of Protocol 28, approved February 2021, now includes the derivation details for all media standards in the CSR and not just those limited to Chapter 4. Let's talk next about the recent comments received on the protocol. Next slide, Cindy. Checking my slides. So this slide and the next provide general information on the comments received in January 2021 on the revised protocol. To start, thank you for the comments provided in January on this protocol. Overall, there were 92 comments received. The majority of the comments were on how this protocol links to Protocol 1, Detailed Risk Assessment. Protocol 1 describes how to conduct risk assessment for contaminated sites in BC. This differs from Protocol 28. As described in this webinar today, Protocol 28, or this protocol, describes how numerical standards are calculated for prescribing in the CSR. Standards are in effect until regulatory change, even upon release of a more recent TRV. Thus, it's possible that a risk-based standard calculated with a defensible TRV may be lower than the CSR numerical standard. The Ministry may consider guidelines and TRVs during the 5-year cycle of review as per CSR Section 68. Director's interim standards set out in EMA may also be considered in special cases. Other comments received requested provision of source or reference information in the protocol. This is not provided in a protocol, as a protocol functions similarly to a regulation. And similar to a regulation, a protocol sets out requirements. Should source or reference information be desired, this information is available on request as an inquiry to the program. Next slide, please, and over to you, Sydney, to wrap up this presentation.
Thanks, George. So carrying on through the comments that we received, and as George mentioned, a common comment related to how Protocol 28 fits into the framework for conducting risk assessment. For example, a number of questions were received asking if the exposure assumptions in Protocol 28 can be used in detailed risk assessment. I would like to clarify on the intent of this protocol. It describes how the Ministry derives the numerical standards that are found in the CSR. Protocol 1, titled Detailed Risk Assessment, contains the requirements for conducting risk assessment of contaminated sites in British Columbia. It is possible that the exposure assumptions from Protocol 28 could be used in risk assessment, but you must ensure you're following the requirements that are set out in Protocol 1. There was some language in Protocol 28 that likely contributed to some of this confusion, so the final posted version has hopefully clarified on this distinction between the two protocols. Finally, we received comments noting errors or inconsistencies in our policies. For example, a different lifespan was used for deriving the vapor standards than is used for other media. Also, the selection of carcinogenic or non-carcinogenic standards doesn't align with Protocol 30, titled Classifying Substances as Carcinogenic. We are aware of these issues, and they may be considered during the next cycle of standards development. Again, if conducting risk assessment in BC for contaminated sites remediation, please follow protocols 1, 13, 20, and 30 as applicable. I'd also like to mention that 2 of those protocols have upcoming webinars. Friday, March 5th is the Protocol 13 titled Screening Level Risk Assessment webinar. And Monday, March 8th is on Protocol 1. So I would recommend registering for those if you'd like further information. Next slide, please. That's everything we have on Protocol 28. Just a reminder that you can subscribe to the site remediation news page in order to remain current with the work that's being done by the land remediation section. And next slide, please. With that, we would like to thank you for your attendance in today's webinar. Any future questions for Protocol 28 or the numerical standards can be sent to the remediation FAQs inbox that's shown on the screen. And we can now take the time to answer questions on the webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Sydney. And the first question is actually going to be directed to you. The question being, for the numerical standards VPHs, LEPHs, and HEPHs, there are no TRVs provided in Appendix 8A or explanation in Section 8.2 as the TRV and the derivation of these parameters. These are common parameters that require a risk-based remediation. Can you provide the equations, exposure factors, and TRVs used in the derivation of VPHs and LEPHs and HEPHs? This is the land of acronyms.
It is, you're right. So inclusion of those substances and their information for standards development may be considered in a future revision to the protocol.
Okay, and the next question is also directed to you, Sydney. The reference to the TRV source for each substance cannot be provided. Can the ministry provide TRV references for each study correlated to the TRV values in the tables?
To obtain that information, I would recommend sending an email to the remediation FAQs that's on the screen, and we can provide that information upon request. So that would be the best way to go about it, please.
Perfect. And the next question is for George. Section 10 states that the non-aqueous phase liquids not present standard is to minimize the potential for a source of soil or water contamination to remain in place. Does this imply that NAPL is expected to be the remediated numerical rather than through risk assessment?
My mic, right? So, so NAPL, how to remediate that? So the CSR includes two sets of remediation approaches, right? So there's numerical. So a site can be remediated to numerical standards, and a site can be remediated to risk-based standards. So there isn't a prohibition under a risk-based approach that you couldn't have NAPL at the site. So the regulation allows for risk-based standards. So in the risk assessment, in this case, it would be a detailed risk assessment. You would need to show that the remaining NAPL presence at the site meets risk-based standards at the site to support an application for a certificate of compliance.
This has been a very technical webinar. That's the last of the questions that we've received at this time. If anybody else has a question, the question box is still open. We can take a moment to let you do that or turn the mic back to Heather. Oh, we do have another question has come in from Ross. The question is for Sydney. For drinking water standards, footnote 12 indicates that it was developed for adults and may not be applicable to younger ages. Does this imply, whoops. Okay, no, that was the end of the question.
I don't know how to answer that one. I'm sorry, I'm not really sure exactly what the question. Oh, there's the follow-up. Any guidance on what to do for other ages? I would again suggest to send in your inquiry to the remediation FAQs inbox, and then we can provide a more detailed answer to your question.
I would add to that too.
Okay.
It's Heather here. Risk assessment needs to be conducted as per Protocol 1, and Protocol 1 requires that all applicable life stages, all relevant exposure pathways, all substances of concern are risk assessed. So it's possible that risk assessment will develop a risk-based standard that is different from the assumptions in the Protocol 28 calculation of the numerical standard. So if you are doing risk assessment with drinking water standards and there's children present, the risk-based standard will differ from the CSR numerical standard. Hopefully that helps, Ross.
Thanks, Heather. And we do have other questions coming in now. In Protocol 4, there are regional background estimates for some metal substances that are the same for all regions. An example being selenium is 4 micrograms per kilogram in all regions. However, in Table 9-1, the provincial background estimate for selenium is listed as 1 microgram per kilogram. Were these derived differently?
Okay, so selenium, the data is the same. It's the same data pool for both Protocol 4 and the provincial background estimate. The samples had been reevaluated more recently, and so the reevaluated data is what's been used in the provincial background estimate. If that data did not meet quality criteria, then it's possible that an older value had been retained, and so I think that would account for the difference between Protocol 4 and what's shown in Protocol 28. That it's the same data, though a different chemical analysis was conducted on it.
Okay, our next question, George, I have one for you from Tony. Wouldn't it be more efficient and fair to provide reference information in a form and at a webinar accessible to all rather than only to those who are aware that a specific email requesting this information is required?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tony. So it's a consideration of housing or providing that information, maybe in some kind of consolidated form. But it remains an issue under internal consideration at this time. So your best option at this point is to come forward with an inquiry submission to the ministry for more specific information.
Okay, and next question to Heather. CSAP has provided a number of questions in their review of Protocol 28. Will the Ministry of Environment be offering written responses to these questions, or should we ask these questions individually? Heather?
Yeah, thanks, Blair. This is a good question. The ministry has been preparing a report that is a written response to comments. So as George mentioned on one of his slides, we received 90 plus comments on this protocol, and the report will be a response to each one of those comments. It will be posted as soon as it moves through approvals. And I'm sorry, I don't know the timeline of that, but the ministry has been preparing that, and it is in the works, and it will be posted to our website at some point in the future. And from what I understand, the indication of when this is posted will be sent out by Site Remediation News. So then you can go and look at this comprehensive report on all the comments received on all of the 10 protocols. If you did have burning questions now, Blair, you are always welcome to submit them via the email on the screen, the remediation FAQs. As I mentioned, I don't know the timeline of that posting of that final report on what we heard. So if you need to, please, there's nothing that should limit you from submitting a question individually if you need to. Thank you.
Thank you. Sydney, I've got a long question for you now. Protocol 28 standard derivation uses the US EPA 2015 Regional Screening Levels, RSL, and modification of the RSL to exposure factors aligning to Method 1. The revision of the US EPA RSLs was not included in Protocol 28. There is no reference or explanation of the differences and similarities in the exposure factors used in the US EPA RSLs other than those modified in point 2. Can the ministry provide a brief summary of the exposure factors used in the RSL calculation and a brief summary of the TRVs used in the RSL calculation?
Okay, so the ministry may consider including more information on the adoption and modification process with the US EPA RSLs for our own standards during a future cycle of Protocol 28 revision. And for specifics on how the US EPA derived their RSL values, I would recommend looking on their webpage for their resources to obtain that information. And then if there's still a bit of uncertainty between what they did and how it compares to our standards, I would then follow up with recommending sending an email to remediation FAQs, and we can maybe try to help at that point. But information about the US EPA RSLs should be obtained from their resources that they provide.
Thank you, Sydney. And Heather, a question for you. Many RAs will be requesting the TRV information. Can you provide this in a guideline or a post somewhere so that environment does not have to answer the same question for multiple requests?
It's a good question, Cindy. Cindy Ott, sorry, the person who submitted the question. The answer is, at this time, no, we will not be providing the TRV information or the source information on a web page or in a document. The route to obtain that information is through an inquiry to the ministry. That is by design, by purpose. That is the way that we desire this to work. So please don't fear. We have a process in place, and we can provide that information when requested.
Thank you, Heather. That appears to be the last of the questions we have this morning. If anybody else has a quick question they would like to post, we do still have a few minutes in the webinar. But failing that, Heather, I will turn it over to you.
Sure, we can give it a last minute or we shall close the webinar. Any last questions, Cindy, or shall we?
There's nothing showing up.
All right, thank you, everyone. We really appreciate from the ministry you attending this webinar today. We appreciate your attendance and your time and joining us, and please do submit questions to the remediation FAQs email on the slide now, and we'd be happy to answer any questions about Protocol 28 or the questions that were received in this webinar. So thank you so much. Have a great day.